They said winter only broke the weak. But that night in Duluth, beneath a sky full of frozen winds, a weary veteran and his German shepherd proved them wrong. He had nothing left, no roof, no road map, only a battle-scarred heart and the dog who refused to leave his side. Then came the crack of ice and a voice. An old man trapped under a fallen signpost, fading fast in the blizzard. One rescue, one spark of courage in the middle of the storm changed everything. Because when the snow settled, what they uncovered wasn't just an old diner. It was the doorway to a destiny neither of them expected. Where are you watching from today? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories of faith and miracles. Winter pressed against Duluth like a great white hand, smothering the harbor city in layers of ice, so thick they seemed carved from ancient stone. Ethan Miller walked slowly through the storm, his boots crunching over the frozen sidewalk, as Lake Superior's wind clawed at him with a cold ferocity that felt personal. Ethan was 34, tall, with wide shoulders shaped by years of military work, though his posture had the slightest hunch, as if the past sat permanently on him like a heavy pack he had never taken off. His face, gaunt from long days of skipped meals, carried the rugged geometry of a man forged by conflict, a defined jaw shaded with unshaved stubble cheekbones, sharp as broken granite, and eyes of a muted storm, gray eyes that had seen both duty and disappointment, and now watched the world with a tired but wary intelligence. His brown hair was uneven, clipped short by his own hand, evidence of a man who did not spend money on anything that wasn't necessary to survival. For months, he had drifted from job to job, never staying long, never settling, never believing he deserved a place to remain. The last job loading crates at the Duluth docks had ended with a supervisor shouting about budget cuts, though Ethan suspected the real reason was the way he froze when he heard the metallic crash of dropped shipping containers. The sound reminded him too much of explosions, and for a moment each time he was back in the desert, ducking for cover. He had tried to hide that reaction, but the docks were no place for a man who sometimes flinched at shadows. His only constant, the one anchor keeping him from drifting into despair, trotted at his side. Ranger, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a coat of deep sable and caramel underlayers, moved with a mix of discipline and instinctive loyalty. His posture was proud, but relaxed. His powerful frame built for endurance and protection, and his amber eyes were bright with an intelligence that was almost unsettling. Ranger had been trained in military canine units, but had never been deployed. Instead, he had become Ethan's companion during rehabilitation, learning to recognize the subtle changes in Ethan's breathing, the tension around his shoulders, the tremor in his fingers that signaled an approaching panic attack. Where Ethan was withdrawn, Ranger was perceptive. Where Ethan doubted his place in the world, Ranger believed fiercely that their place was together. On this night, as the storm thickened into a whiteout, Ranger walked slightly ahead, nose low, tail flicking with alert precision. Ethan stuffed his hands deeper into his frayed gloves. He had $3 left in his coat pocket, and no idea where to sleep. Duluth's shelters filled quickly during winter storms, and he hated the feeling of being watched, the questioning looks, the pitying nods. He preferred the cold honesty of the streets. At least the snow did not judge him. The wind howled as it swept down the steep hill overlooking the harbor. Ethan paused, squinting against the swirling white chaos, trying to decide whether to continue to the waterfront stairwell, where he sometimes slept. Ranger suddenly stiffened. His ears shot upward, his entire body tightening like a drawn bow. Then he barked, sharp, urgent, insistent. Ranger Ethan murmured, his voice hoarse from hours of silence. Ranger tugged at the end of his leash, pulling him toward a narrow alley between two brick buildings. Ethan hesitated. The alley was dark, half buried under snowdrifts, But Ranger barked again, 3 quick barks, the same pattern he used during training whenever he sensed danger or distress. Ethan followed. The wind funneled between the buildings, colder here, slicing across Ethan's cheeks. Ranger disappeared behind a mound of snow. A muffled groan reached Ethan's ears. "Hello?" His voice echoed. No reply, only another soft groan, frail and breathless. Ethan pushed forward, brushing snow away with his gloved hands. There, half buried beneath shattered ice, lay an elderly man. He was thin, almost delicate, his back hunched, as if years of carrying quiet burdens had curved his spine. His hair, silver wispy, stuck to his forehead, contrasted with his dark coat, which looked far too light for the storm. His face had the pale, waxy tone of someone close to losing consciousness, and yet his eyes behind fogged glasses held a stubborn fierceness. Ethan knelt beside him, noticing the man clutched a worn canvas bag against his chest, as if it held something dearer than his own life. "Sir, can you hear me?" Ethan asked. The man tried to speak, but his lips trembled uncontrollably. Ethan slid his arms beneath the man's back and legs. He was surprisingly light bones and thin muscle under soaked clothing. Ranger circled them anxiously, barking once, then pacing toward the mouth of the alley, urging Ethan to move. Ethan knew he couldn't take the old man to a hospital. No car, no phone, no open clinic nearby. But leaving him here was a death sentence. Snow began drifting across the man's boots, threatening to bury him again. "Okay." "Hang on," Ethan whispered. He lifted the man onto his back, adjusting the frail weight so it wouldn't slip. The elderly man let out a weak cough, gripping Ethan's shoulder for balance. "We've got you," Ethan assured him. He didn't know if the man could understand him, but saying the words steadied something inside Ethan, something he thought long gone, the instinct to protect. Ranger trotted ahead, checking the path, barking whenever Ethan needed to turn or avoid a patch of ice. They moved slowly through the storm, each step a battle. Snow blinded Ethan's eyes, and his breath came out in harsh clouds that froze against his scarf. The elderly man shivered violently behind him. Almost there, Ethan murmured, though he wasn't sure where there was. Then Ranger stopped right in front of an old wooden building, half hidden by the storm. A crooked sign hung above the door, its paint nearly worn away, but Ethan could make out the faded letters, Harbor Light Diner. One light glowed weakly inside, flickering like a stubborn flame refusing to die. Ethan pushed the door open with his shoulder. Warmth, faint but real, washed over him. "Sir," he whispered, "we made it." The old man exhaled the sound, fragile but relieved. Ethan carried him inside, Ranger slipping in behind, like a guardian sealing the world out. The diner smelled of old coffee, simmering broth, and memories thick enough to touch. Ethan didn't know it yet, but crossing that threshold one desperate night in Duluth would become the moment that changed everything. The warmth inside Harbor Light Diner felt almost unreal after the brutality of the Duluth storm, as though Ethan Miller and Ranger had stepped through a doorway that led not just into a restaurant, but into a pocket of time where the world loosened its grip. Walter Harris, the elderly man they had rescued, now rested on a small cot in a room behind the kitchen, his frail body bundled under layers of mismatched quilts. Earlier that day, once he was steady enough to speak, he told Ethan his name with a quiet dignity that suggested he'd once been far more than a man struggling against winter. Walter was 78, thin as a rail, with skin pale but warm-toned, thinned by age but not by weakness of spirit. His hair, silver and soft, curled at the edges of his collar, and his eyes were a sharp blue-gray, the kind of eyes that still carried the spark of a man who had lived fully even if his bones now protested each step. His voice held a gentle rasp that came from years of talking in cold harbor air, and nights spent alone closing up a diner meant for strangers who needed refuge more than food. Ethan learned Walter had run Harbor Light for nearly 50 years. The diner with its scratched floors and old booths patched with duct tape had survived Storm's recessions, and a handful of owners before Walter finally claimed it as the legacy he never meant to build. He served cheap meals without asking questions, poured coffee with a steady hand, and listened without judgment. He called himself a man with no children but 1,000 sons, and Ethan suspected that wasn't an exaggeration. After helping Walter settle, Ethan had spent the rest of the evening fixing the shattered glass on the front door, a task he tackled with the precision of someone who once built outposts in deserts far from home. The wind had hurled a loose branch through the diner's window earlier, and without Ethan's hands and Ranger's vigilance, the cold would have reclaimed the place again that night. The diner itself appeared humble at first glance. A row of faded red stools lined the counter, each one dented by decades of elbows and laughter. Photographs covered the walls, sailors toasting mugs of steaming coffee, truckers smiling with exhaustion after midnight drives. Young Marines posing stiffly in uniform, men and women, who once passed through Walter's door and left pieces of their stories behind. Ethan moved through the diner, quietly repairing a hinge here and a loose board there, not because he was asked to, but because something inside him needed the work, needed a task steady enough to drown the noise in his head. Ranger paced the floor and practiced patrol arcs, his nails clicking soft rhythms on the linoleum. His body was tense but not fearful, more like a guardian settling into new territory. His black and rust fur caught the warmth from the diner lights, making him look almost like a creature carved from the hearth itself. Ranger's focus kept drifting toward one specific section of wall, a wooden panel just beside the cash register, darker than the rest, polished more frequently. At first, Ethan dismissed Ranger's low growls as sensitivity to new smells. But when Ranger sat directly in front of the wall, nose pressed to the boards, ears forward, tail stiff, Ethan stopped sweeping and took notice. "You smell mice," he asked quietly, though Ranger rarely made such a fuss over rodents. Ranger scratched the wall gently, 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. A pattern that came from training a signal he used only when something felt off beneath the surface. Ethan crouched down and pressed his ear against the wood. Nothing. Just the hum of an old building trying to hold itself together. But Ranger cawed his paw again, firmer this time, glancing at Ethan, the way he did in their hardest moments overseas, insistent, urgent, certain. Hours later, with Walter resting in the back, Ethan returned to the dining room. He paused to check on the old man through the cracked door. Walter slept curled on his side, one hand still gripping the canvas bag he refused to part with. Ethan understood that instinct. Some things, no matter how little you owned, couldn't be released. Ranger trotted ahead into the dining room and immediately sat before the same wooden panel. Ethan sighed. "All right, show me." He knelt beside the dog, running his fingers along the boards. One plank felt colder than the others, slightly raised. When he tapped it with his knuckles, the sound changed from a hollow thud to something emptier, deeper. Hidden space. Hidden truth. Ethan scanned the diner. Nothing seemed disturbed, yet the storm outside whistled with a strange pressure that felt like the world urging him to open the wall. He grabbed a butter knife from behind the counter and eased the blade into the seam between the boards. The wood resisted at first, as if guarding itself, then gave way with a soft snap. A thin panel swung outward, releasing a faint smell of aged paper dust and the ghost of old ink. Inside the narrow cavity lay bundles of envelopes tied with fraying string, stacks of old receipts, a few folded letters with edges browned by time. But the object that captured Ethan's breath was a thick notebook bound in cracked black leather. The cover was worn smooth by hands that must have touched it every day for decades. Ethan pulled the notebook out, careful not to disturb the other contents. Ranger sniffed the book gently, tail lowering, as if sensing something sacred. Ethan opened the first page. A name, then another, then another. Hundreds of them handwritten in neat block letters, some whole, some faded. Next to each name, short notes in Walter's cramped handwriting. Got a job at the steel mill. Sober 6 months. Found wife back together now. Left town. Sent a postcard from Denver. These weren't debts. These were lives. Lives that had crossed Walter's door when they were broken, hungry, alone. This was no ledger of money. This was a record of people Walter had fed for free, people he'd believed in even when they didn't believe in themselves. A record of quiet miracles. Ethan turned a few more pages. He found no tally marks, no reminders to collect payment, no bitterness. Only hope, only gratitude, only a man trying to leave the world better than he found it. Ethan's throat tightened. He felt something he hadn't in years, an ache that wasn't pain but longing, longing to matter, longing to be more than a drifter surviving the winter. He closed the book, holding it against his chest for a long moment. Ranger nudged his knee gently. "Yeah," Ethan murmured. "I know." They stayed there in silence until a harsh coughing fit erupted from the back room. Walter's voice, thin and desperate, broke the quiet. Ethan rushed to him. Walter sat upright, face pale, breath wheezing, as though the storm had chased him indoors and lodged itself inside his lungs. Ethan eased him back down. "You're okay," he said softly. Walter's hand trembled, but managed to point toward the front of the diner. Did you hear it?" Walter whispered. "Something tapping." Ethan hesitated, wondering how much truth to reveal. "Just the building settling," he said gently. Yet he knew the lie sat poorly in his mouth. Ranger sat beside the cot, watching Walter with soft amber eyes. Walter reached to touch the dog's head, fingers shaking but warm. "Smart dog," he murmured. "Smarter than most people." Ethan swallowed hard, wanting to tell him about the notebook, but something inside told him to wait. Walter needed rest, not revelations. "I'll close up," Ethan said. "Get some sleep." Walter nodded weakly, eyes drifting shut. Ethan turned off the light in the back and walked toward the front. Ranger's paws, padding quietly beside him. Before closing the hidden cavity, Ethan looked once more at the notebook, at the dozens of names marked, "Made it healed, kept going." And he understood Walter wasn't just feeding people. He was saving them. The storm outside howled, but inside Harbor Light Diner, Ethan felt the faintest warmth of something he hadn't known in a long time. Purpose. Ranger curled at his feet. Ethan slid the notebook back into the wall, but he knew this discovery, this secret, would not stay hidden for long. Not now. Not with what the night had revealed. The chapter ends here with Ethan standing in the dim glow of the diner, realizing that the life he stumbled into, one he thought was an accident, may have been waiting for him all along. Snow drifted past the diner windows in long, slanted veils, as if winter itself were spying on Harbor Light from behind its frozen curtain, waiting to see what would break first, the building, the people inside it, or the man trying to protect it. Ethan Miller felt that weight every time he looked at Walter Harris, hunched over the counter ends, shaking, as he wiped a mug that had been cleaned 10 minutes ago. Walter's strength had faded more each day, his coughs deeper, his steps shorter, but his eyes still held a kind of quiet certainty, a steady faith in the diner that made Ethan simultaneously grateful and terrified. He didn't want to lose this place. He didn't want to lose the old man. Ranger sensed it before Ethan did. The German shepherd, with his sable and tan coat thickening for winter, prowled the diner like a seasoned guard, moving with a seriousness that made Ethan uneasy. Ranger paused near the front booth, ears flicking toward the window, as footsteps crunched outside. Ethan glanced toward the door, and that was the moment Mark Sullivan walked into Harbor Light Diner, as though he already owned it. Mark was in his mid-40s, tall and sleek, the type of man who looked polished even in a snowstorm. His overcoat was deep charcoal, tailored to show off a trim frame. His hair was slicked back black as wet asphalt, and not a single snowflake dared cling to it. His face was sharp, handsome, in that expensive, hollow way, thin lips, a clean jaw shaved so smooth it seemed to shine, and eyes the color of nickel, metallic, cold, and transactional. Everything about Mark suggested a man used to winning, and a man who enjoyed taking things from people who couldn't fight back. "Afternoon," Mark said with a smile so smooth it seemed laminated. "I was hoping to speak with the owner." Walter lifted his head slowly. "You're looking at him," he rasped, voice coarse from age and decades of shouting orders across a noisy kitchen. Ranger growled low, and Mark's gaze flickered dismissively toward the dog, the way someone might look at a stray that didn't affect the bottom line. Ethan stepped closer to Walter's side. Something in Mark's presence raked at the edges of his instincts, stirring the part of him trained to recognize danger long before civilians did. Mark slipped off his gloves with deliberate elegance and sat at the nearest booth without waiting to be invited. "Let's not dance around it," he said, leaning back with a confident ease. "Harbor Light is a charming place, Mr. Harris. But it's old, it's failing, and frankly, it's wasting prime property." Walter's brows rose slowly. "Prime property, lakefront view," Mark said. "The last untouched building in this block. You've been breaking even at best, probably losing money most years. The town's redevelopment plans make this building extremely valuable to the right developer." His smile hardened. "Such as me." Ethan stiffened. Mark Sullivan wasn't just here to talk. He was here to take. Walter's voice cracked slightly, whether from age or irritation. "Son, this diner has fed folks who didn't have a dollar in their pocket. And it'll keep doing that as long as I've got breath." Mark shrugged lightly. "And that's admirable. Truly. But times change. People with money want modern comforts. Boutique hotels, upscale dining. I intend to build something memorable." He reached into his briefcase and placed a crisp envelope on the table. Its weight thudded softly against the wood. "My offer." Walter didn't touch it. Ethan didn't want to. Mark's voice dropped. "More money than you'd make here for the rest of your life." Ethan looked at Walter. The old man's hands didn't tremble from age this time, but from something else. Something like sorrow. Mark turned toward Ethan, lips curling faintly. "And I understand you've fallen on hard times yourself. A fresh start might be beneficial." Ethan's jaw locked. He wasn't offended by the words. He was offended by the pleasure Mark took in saying them. Ranger let out a short, sharp bark that echoed off the walls. Mark flinched, but only slightly. "Call your dog off." Ethan didn't move. Ranger didn't either. Walter finally exhaled. "Take your offer," he said quietly, "and walk it right back out that door." Mark tilted his head, studying the old man as though puzzled he wasn't folding. "You should think this through. Time isn't on your side." He adjusted his coat and stood. "Talk to your helper." You may find he prefers my offer." Ethan didn't respond, but his fingers curled into fists at his sides. Mark left the diner with a satisfied smirk, like a man who believed he had already won. The bell above the door jingled, sounding smaller than usual, almost nervous. Walter tapped Ethan's arm. "Don't fret over the likes of him," he said softly. "Greed makes men deaf to the things that matter." Ethan nodded, but the unease lingered long after Mark disappeared into the snowfall. That night, as Walter rested in his room, Ethan stayed behind in the kitchen, wiping down counters. Ranger paced the floor, nose twitching, tail stiff. He kept glancing toward the back door. "What's wrong, boy?" Ethan whispered. Ranger froze. Ears shot forward. Then he erupted into a violent warning bark that made Ethan's heart hammer. Ethan sprinted to the back door. A strange, acrid scent hit him instantly, sharp, chemical, dangerous. Gasoline. He flung the door open. Ranger bolted into the snow, circling the small alcove outside the kitchen. A rag drenched and darkened with accelerant had been shoved against the vent pipe. A single match would have turned the chimney into a torch, and the diner into an obituary. Ethan's breath fogged sharply as he scanned the empty alley. Footprints led into the white darkness, but vanished just as quickly, swallowed by the ongoing storm. Someone had planned this. Someone wanted Harbor Light gone. Ethan grabbed the rag with a towel, tossed it into the metal sink, and rinsed it until water ran clear. Ranger continued growling, tail stiff, body rigid, pointing his gaze toward the direction of the street where Mark had walked earlier. Ethan knew better than to assume coincidence. He called the police. 2 officers arrived, Duluth locals, polite but tired-looking. They inspected the area, took statements, but their expressions told Ethan what he already knew. Without proof, this would go nowhere. "Storm probably blew it in," one officer said, though his tone lacked conviction. "We'll file a report." They left. The alley returned to being nothing more than a dark doorway behind a diner. But Ethan felt the shift. He could sense danger like a pressure system. And tonight, the air was thick with it. He locked every door, checked every window. Ranger stayed stationed at the back entrance, muscles tight beneath his thick winter coat. Ethan knelt beside him. "We'll protect this place," he murmured. Ranger answered with a low rumble, the kind he used in combat simulations. "A guardian's vow." The diner lights dimmed shadows stretching across its worn floors and framed photographs. And in that quiet, dim glow, Ethan felt something rise inside him. Not panic, not fear, but resolve. Someone wanted Harbor Light erased from Duluth. But Ethan Miller had spent his life fighting battles others walked away from, and Ranger had never failed him. As snow battered the windows like cold fists, the 2 stood watch over the diner, a wounded man and a loyal shepherd, defending a place that meant more to them than either could fully admit. The chapter ends here with greed circling like a wolf in the winter dark, unaware that Harbor Light now had a soldier guarding its flame. Morning came to Duluth wrapped in gray light and quiet dread, as if the storm from the night before had whispered its secrets through every cracked window and crooked alleyway. By the time Ethan Miller stepped outside Harbor Light Diner to shovel the overnight snow, the whispers had already grown into rumors, and the rumors had become something sharper, fear threaded with anger. People in Duluth talked. They always had. But today, their voices carried tremors of unease, glances over shoulders, muttered warnings about someone trying to burn the diner down, and that developer who wants the whole block gone. Ethan felt the weight of it while clearing the steps. Ranger stood beside him, tail low, ears forward, nose lifting with each passing voice as though he could smell the tension carried in the air. Walter Harris remained inside, still coughing lightly, the lines on his face deeper than ever. Ethan doubted the old man fully grasped how quickly the story of the attempted arson had spread. But the town did, and the town remembered. The first person who walked in that morning was a middle-aged woman bundled in a puffy maroon winter coat, her dark brown hair streaked with early gray. Her features were soft, yet exhaustion clung to her like a shadow. Her name was Linda Brewer, and Ethan recognized her vaguely, someone who'd occasionally bought a bowl of soup and stayed longer than she ate. Today her eyes were red, as though she'd spent the night wrestling with old memories. A small boy of about 7 clung to her hand, a skinny child with curly blonde hair peeking out beneath a knitted hat, cheeks pink from the cold. "Mr. Miller," Linda said quietly, using his last name with the respectful tone of someone raised to speak gently to people who've suffered. "I heard what happened." Ethan only nodded, unsure how to respond. She pressed a hand to her heart. "Years ago, when I lost my job, when my husband left, Walter fed me and my boy all winter. If he didn't, we would have been sleeping out by the shipping yard." She swallowed hard, eyes shimmering. "I'm here to help. Whatever you're doing to keep this place alive, I'm in." The boy tugged on Ranger's ear, and Ranger responded by leaning gently into the child's small body tail, wagging for the first time that morning. Ethan felt a spark of something warm break through his ribs. Hope, maybe, or the first hint of solidarity. More people came as the hours passed. A trucker named Mike Granger, a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s with thick stubble and bags under his eyes like dark bruises, pushed open the diner door around noon. His denim jacket was dusted with road salt, and his boots thudded heavily on the floor. "Long haul from Fargo," he muttered, placing an envelope on the counter. "Had to stop." Ethan frowned. "For food?" "For this," Mike said, tapping the envelope with one thick finger. "Walter saved my damn life once. Found me drinking myself sick in that corner booth over there." He pointed toward a stool near the window, the one with the worn cushion and a single tear down the vinyl. He handed me coffee and said, "Son, you want to try one more day." I don't know why, but I listened. He walked out without waiting for thanks. Ranger barked softly after him, as if sending him off with respect. Ethan opened the envelope once he was gone. It held $200. Word spread faster than the snow fell. Soon the diner door swung open again, this time revealing a woman in her late 50s, Pastor Ruth Ellington. She was tall, with silver blonde hair gathered in a loose bun, and a face lined more by compassion than age. Her blue eyes were earnest, steady, like someone who had spent years comforting grief. "Walter's Diner has held this town together longer than any church sermon," she said gently. "So we're starting something. A campaign. Save Harbor Light." She explained how several people, truckers, veterans, fishermen, single mothers, had agreed to gather supplies, repaint the diner share. Walter's acts of kindness on social media, maybe even contact local reporters. A group of high schoolers volunteered to film the process. One of them, Tyler Cross, a wiry 18-year-old with messy black hair and a camera strapped to his chest, peeked past Ruth. His acne-marked face brightened when Ranger approached. "We're gonna make a video," Tyler said breathlessly. "Show what this place means." "My dad said Walter paid for his groceries when he was laid off from the mill. People should know that." Ethan felt overwhelmed in a way that made his throat tighten. He'd spent so much of his life believing no one cared, believing the world was full of people like Mark Sullivan, people who took and left ruin behind. Yet here, gathered under the humble neon glow of the diner sign, stood people who came not to take, but to give. And through it all, Ranger supervised like an invisible foreman, weaving among legs, nosing paintbrushes, barking directions in short bursts that sent the teenagers into fits of laughter. He was the spirit of the diner in a dog's sturdy frame, loyal, commanding, ever watchful. Within 2 days, Harbor Light transformed into something out of a hopeful dream. Volunteers scrubbed the floors, repaired the window Mark had smashed with his arrogance patched holes in the drywall. The yellowed ceiling tiles were replaced, and Pastor Ruth coordinated a donation of new lights. Linda Brewer and another volunteer baked cookies and distributed them to workers. Even the grumpy mailman helped paint the outer trim. Walter sat at his usual booth wrapped in a warm blanket, watching the revival with a faint smile. "I don't deserve all this fuss," he muttered. But Ethan saw in the trembling of the old man's hands that the attention touched him deeply. On the third afternoon, while clearing the attic with Tyler, Ethan discovered a rusted metal box buried beneath old newspapers. It was small, locked, and so corroded along the edges it nearly crumbled in his hands. "Looks ancient," Tyler said, wiping dust from his cheek. "Want me to film opening it?" Ethan shook his head. "Not this. This feels personal." They brought the box downstairs. Ranger sniffed it intensely, tail wagging once before planting himself beside it protectively. Ethan used a flathead screwdriver to pry it open carefully. The lid gave way with a groan, like some old spirit releasing a long-held breath. Inside lay a tarnished military medal, an old bronze star. Beneath it, folded with precision, was a letter. Ethan unfolded it gently. The handwriting was thin, wobbly, but deliberate. "To the veteran who walks into this diner last." Ethan's breath stilled. The letter revealed a different Walter, one he had not yet seen. A young soldier consumed by rage after losing comrades in a war he never fully healed from. Walter wrote about returning home, wanting to burn the world that took so many lives, until he walked past a hungry man shivering outside a closed shop. Something inside Walter broke open that night. Instead of lighting a fuse, he lit a stove. He made soup, fed one stranger, then another, and another. "If you're reading this, Tom," the letter continued, "it means you are lost like I was. Let this place be your compass. Let hope be your orders, and let kindness be your weapon." Ethan lowered the letter with shaking hands. He felt the old ache in his chest, the guilt, the memories, the noise of war, and for the first time in a long time the noise quieted. Ranger pressed his head against Ethan's knee. The dog always sensed everything. Ethan whispered, "Maybe this is where we're meant to be, boy." Ranger barked once, firm and certain. And the chapter ends with Ethan standing in the middle of a diner, surrounded by strangers who had become allies. An old man who had become a mentor, and a dog who had become his anchor, holding the letter that told him he was no longer lost. Snow fell over Duluth with a tenderness that contrasted cruelly against the heaviness in the air, the flakes drifting like slow white confessions from a sky too pale to hold any warmth. Inside Harbor Light. Diner, the lamps glowed softly against the windows, their amber light trembling against the storm, as if reluctant to face what awaited inside. Walter Harris had grown weaker with each passing sunrise. His frame, once lean but steady, now seemed fragile as paper, his breath shallow, his voice barely more than a tired whisper. For days he'd insisted he was just winded, but when Ethan lifted him into the booth one morning and felt the tremor in the old man's chest, he knew something far heavier was unfolding. Ethan drove him to the hospital, St. Luke's, a squat building with fluorescent lights and antiseptic floors that seemed to swallow hope. The nurse who checked Walter in was Carla Jensen, a woman in her early 40s, with a round, open face, freckles scattered across pale skin, and auburn hair pulled back into a frizzy bun. Her hazel eyes were soft with understanding, and she treated Walter with the kind of gentle efficiency that came from years of witnessing families splinter at the threshold of illness. She spoke softly, with a reassuring cadence that made even bad news sound survivable. Ethan stayed by Walter's bedside for hours, Ranger curled quietly beneath the chair, his aging body still positioned protectively between Ethan and the world. Ranger's muzzle, once sharply defined with black markings, now carried subtle silver streaks, a sign he too was marching beside time. Walter held onto Ethan's hand, his fingers cold but still strong enough to press a final grateful squeeze. "You found your compass," he whispered, voice barely audible. "Don't lose it." Ethan blinked away, the sting in his eyes. "I'm here. Ranger's here. We're not going anywhere." Walter smiled weakly. "Good." He exhaled. Then another breath. Then none at all. The monitors hummed steadily, indifferent to the moment. Ethan felt something inside him collapse like an old building. Ranger's ears flattened. He let out a low, mournful whine as if he sensed the final note of Walter's life drifting into silence. The funeral was small, just how Walter would have wanted it. A few former customers stood beneath black umbrellas, their breaths steaming in the cold, as Pastor Ruth spoke gentle words about kindness and service. Linda Brewer held her son Eli close. The teenager Tyler Cross filmed respectfully from a distance, wanting the town to remember the man behind the diner's glow. After the burial, a man stepped toward Ethan with purposeful steps. He wore a dark overcoat and carried a briefcase. His name was Gerald Lawson, a lawyer in his 50s with a tall but slightly stooped posture, thinning sandy hair combed carefully across his head, and a face lined with the kind of deep-set wrinkles that came from years of reading too many contracts and witnessing too many human failings. But his eyes were kind, warm brown, and earnest, and when he spoke, his voice carried a sincerity uncommon in his profession. "Mr. Miller," he said gently, offering Ethan an envelope. Walter left instructions. "I believe this belongs to you." Inside was the will, a single-page document handwritten but legally notarized, stating in clear wording that Harbor Light Diner, the building and all its assets, were to be transferred to Ethan Miller on one condition: that the keeper of Harbor Light must serve at least one warm meal each winter day to those who cannot pay. Ethan felt overwhelmed, humbled, and unworthy all at once. He wasn't family. He wasn't a long-time employee. He was a broken man who'd stumbled into the diner by accident. Yet in Walter's eyes, he had been the chosen heir. Word spread quickly, and with it came the inevitable storm. Mark Sullivan, the man who had once tried to buy the diner. He returned with ice in his smile, dressed in a tailored winter coat, and flanked by two associates, sharp-faced men in black suits who smelled of money and threat. Mark's hair, perfectly styled as always, held not a single snowflake. His gray eyes glittered with vindictive satisfaction. "I'm contesting the will," he said coolly. "That building was promised to me verbally by Walter months ago, and I'm certain a man in his condition wasn't thinking clearly." Ethan's jaw tightened. "The will is legal." Mark spread his hands dramatically. "We'll see what the court thinks about missing tax records, ancient building permits, and possible safety code violations." He smirked. "Old places like Harbor Light tend to have skeletons." For a moment, Ethan felt the old helplessness rise, the sense of fighting battles he could never win. But then Gerald Lawson stepped forward, his stooped posture straightening with surprising authority. "We have documentation," the lawyer said calmly. "All of it." He referenced the rusted metal box Ethan had found earlier. Walter's Metals community service certificates, letters from people he'd helped, and decades-old maintenance permits. The diner had been registered as a charitable establishment, granting tax exemptions and protection under the city's heritage ordinances. Gerald presented every paper with methodical precision. Mark's smile faltered. By the time they reached court, the judge, Margaret Whitford, a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair cut in a tidy bob and a gaze sharp enough to slice lies in half, listened impassively to both sides. Mark argued aggressively, waving claims of mismanagement and unsafe structure. Ethan stood silent beside Gerald, hands clenched, heart-pounding Ranger, lying calmly at his feet like a living oath. Gerald presented the letters, the permits, the testimonies. Linda spoke. Pastor Ruth spoke. The trucker Mike appeared in the gallery, arms crossed, eyes full of fire. When Ranger barked once, sharp and certain, the courtroom went silent. Judge Whitford finally spoke. "Harbor Light Diner," she said, adjusting her glasses, "is hereby recognized as a community heritage site. Its ownership shall remain with Mr. Ethan Miller in accordance with Walter Harris's will." Mark's expression collapsed. The judge continued. "Mr. Sullivan, your attempts to undermine this establishment, including the hiring of unauthorized inspectors, are noted and will be reported." By the time Mark stormed out of the courtroom, his coat flaring behind him like the tail of a retreating vulture, the people of Duluth erupted into applause. Winter passed slowly, replacing sorrow with routine. Ethan poured himself into the diner, repairing floors, scrubbing walls, repainting signs. Ranger, though older now, maintained his guardian post near the fireplace, his golden eyes following every unfamiliar face with a mixture of curiosity and gentle scrutiny. A year later, under a new coat of cream paint and a freshly hung sign reading Harbor Light Diner, Home for the Weary, the place glowed each evening like a beacon against the cold Canadian air sweeping across Lake Superior. A smaller plaque beneath the sign read, "In loving memory of Walter Harris and Ranger's watch." Ranger's muzzle was grayer now, his steps slower, but his heart remained steadfast. He inspected each guest with the quiet dignity of a king guarding a kingdom, built not of walls, but of warmth. Ethan was no longer a drifter. He was the keeper of Harbor Light, the veteran of weary souls, the guardian of a promise, the man who learned that miracles didn't always shout from the heavens. Sometimes they whispered from behind wooden walls, from a bowl of soup, from a dog's steady loyalty, and from the faint glow of a small diner determined to keep hearts warm. And as snow danced outside the windows and Ranger let out a contented sigh by the fire, Ethan understood. Some miracles arrive not as thunder, but as light. On the end, the story of Harbor Light reminds us that God's miracles don't always arrive wrapped in thunder or shining with heavenly fire. Sometimes they come quietly, through a warm bowl of soup on a freezing night, through a stranger who offers a helping hand, or through a loyal dog who refuses to leave your side. Ethan Miller didn't find salvation in grand gestures, but in the small, steady acts of love that God places along our path. And maybe that is how heaven speaks most clearly, in gentle nudges, in open doors, in the soft glow of a diner window on a winter night. As you walk through your own days, may you remember that miracles often look like ordinary moments touched by grace, that a kind word can save a weary heart, that a simple meal can restore someone's hope, that God works through people like Walter Ethan and even Ranger to remind us we are never truly alone. If this story touched your spirit, share it with someone who may need a reminder that light still exists in dark seasons. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where your own miracle has shown up in everyday life. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of faith, resilience, and the quiet ways God moves through the world. May the Lord bless you, protect you, and guide every step you take. And may every act of kindness you give echo like a silver bell in God's hands. Amen.